All right, so it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Andrew Westbrook. Dr. Westbrook began his career in environmental science and engineering. He then began his journey as a cognitive neuroscientist at Washington University in St. Louis, followed by postdoctoral training at Brown University and the Donders Institute. Throughout his training, he's been highly successful in receiving funding for his work that focuses on cognitive effort. And in 2023, he joined the Rutgers University Center for Advanced Human Brain Imaging Research as an assistant professor of psychiatry. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Westbrook for his talk entitled What Criticality Tells Us About Brain Maturation, Excitation, Inhibition, Balance, and Cognitive Effort.
Oh, thank you, Colleen. That was really nice. Yeah, thank you again for this opportunity. I'm very excited to be here. As I was mentioning earlier, I'm starting on a kind of a new direction in our work, and certainly a new direction for the lab, which we've just started here at Rutgers. And so it's in a great spot for feedback. So I'm really eager for the conversation after this. And feel free to stop me along the way if you have questions as well. You would probably be best just to butt in. I won't be able to monitor hands very closely, but. So yes, so I'm going to be talking today about what criticality tells us about brain maturation, EI balance, and cognitive effort. And the truth is that I got into this notion of brain criticality when I was thinking about cognitive effort, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But we've learned a lot about other dynamics, such as the brain maturation process, especially the transition from childhood through adolescence into adulthood, and a lot about cortical excitability along the way. So first off, what is criticality? We start with the observation that the brain is a complex and also dynamical system. And in the universe, there are a lot of complex dynamical systems, and they sometimes they operate in one sort of phase or regime, and sometimes they operate in another. And the question is, what happens when you get right at the boundary between different dynamical regimes? So, you might think about water. Under one temperature, you have the same molecules that form a crystalline lattice, and you have ice, and it has very different dynamical properties than when you turn the temperature up and that ice melts, and all of a sudden you have a fluid. Again, it's the same substrate, but with some tweaks to a control parameter, you get very different dynamical regimes. And as I mentioned, criticality is what happens. You might remember your chemistry classes. What happens when you're at the critical point, where you're right at the boundary between the transition between different dynamical regimes. And there's some interesting work suggesting that the brain, again, another complex dynamical system, also operates at a kind of phase transition. And this has really important implications for cognition. And that's what our lab is really starting to explore. So to give you an intuition about this, I'm going to take an example that's been studied extensively in statistical mechanics, and that is the Ising model. So the Ising model is a model of a magnetic lattice. It's a 2D lattice simulated here, and you have atoms that compose the lattice that have orbital upspins or downspins. And they have an influence over their neighbors. So you can imagine this guy here with a downspin is sort of biasing its neighbors to flip into a downspin on the next time step. And then this one here is biasing its neighbors to be in an upspin on the next time step. And so you can look at how these units interact with one another and what sort of dynamics evolve over time. And so we'll randomly initialize a 2D network like this. And then we're going to play around with the control parameter. Again, in this case, we're going to use temperature. So we're going to start off with a case where we turn the temperature down and we get into a subcritical regime. And in a subcritical regime, what you notice is that basically all of the activity locally is dominated by local interactions. And so you get very stable patterns of areas that are all sort of in an orbital upspin or a downspin. But there's a lot of stability in this system. Now we're going to turn the temperature up, and we're going to add a lot of thermal energy to the system, and we get into a supercritical regime. And in the supercritical regime, we get very different behavior, so completely different dynamics here. But there's also some similarities between the two. So in both cases, the subcritical and the supercritical, if we were to introduce information into the system, you can tell that the system that information would not persist, but for very different reasons. So as an example, if I were to flip one unit in this upper right-hand corner of this subcritical grid, you would tell that basically it would flip back to whatever's going on locally in the next time step. Again, that stability sort of dominates. And then in the supercritical case, if you were to flip one unit, in the next time step, that information would be lost because it's overwhelmed by the thermal energy of the system. And so from a computational standpoint, neither of these systems are very good at responding to new information or for that information to persist over time. Even though they're very different systems, they share this property in common. Another sort of common property between these two different systems is that they both have relatively low entropy. So you can tell that on the left-hand case in subcritical state, everything is low frequency. There's only one kind of frequency represented. And this is also true in the supercritical state. Everything is high frequency. But again, it's only one sort of frequency band that's represented. So now the interesting question becomes, what happens when we adjust the temperature just right at the critical point between these two, at the transition between these two different phases? And here we get critical dynamics. And so critical dynamics are super interesting, and there's a lot of very unique properties that arise. They're emergent properties which only exist at a critical point. So one of them is you get, going in reverse, what I've just said, you get high entropy. So in this case, you don't have one spatial frequency, but you have all sorts of spatial frequencies represented. You have big stuff, you have small stuff, and in critical systems, the distribution of the sizes and the frequencies that are represented is power law. There's a power law representation, which is to say decreasing amounts of very big stuff, but they're still there. And in fact, you can get in an infinitely large system, infinitely large areas that are all in an orbital upstate or downstate, for example. But you also get susceptibility. So in this case, if you were to flip one unit in the upper right-hand corner of the critical grid, the probability that that information would influence its neighbors and that it would spread over time and space is provably maximal in a critical system. So now all of a sudden, at this very fine critical point, right at the boundary between these two phases, you get this property of susceptibility and the persistence of new information over time. And so that, of course, you can intuit how that would be very important for cognition. So when we think about critical systems, they have some really nice properties, some very unique emergent properties, which are important for, that would be useful for information processing. So one is they maximize entropy, so they can contain lots of information of different bandwidths. There's also maximal flexibility and susceptibility, as I talked through. And finally, there's this property of long-range correlations. So this is what when I said that you could flip one unit and that information propagates over space and time. That's the idea here. So long-range correlations are a property of a system that enables it to pass information over space and time. All right. So now we can think about how we might try to evaluate these emergent properties in brains. And so one is if we think about what are called avalanche dynamics. And so there is a branching process we can use to study this theoretically. So if we think about an artificial array of neurons, and we put some information into the system, we inject some activity, so the first 4 units are active. Then we ask what happens in subsequent time steps. And in a subcritical system, when we're not playing with the temperature here, but instead we're playing with the balance of excitation and inhibition. In a subcritical case, we have inhibition dominance. So you inject some information into the system, and then over time, the number of neurons that are active as a result drops off pretty quickly. And we can quantify that we're in a subcritical state by taking the ratio of the number of active neurons on the second time step to the number of neurons active on the first time step. And if that ratio is below 1, we'll say that we're in a subcritical state. Then we can turn up cortical excitability, or in this artificial network excitability, so that if we inject some information into the system, we make 1 neuron active. Pretty soon, 3 neurons are active, and then the whole array is active. So in this hyperexcitable supercritical state, the ratio would be above 1, and that's how we can detect that we're in a supercritical regime. Now, neither of these subcritical or supercritical states are very good for brain function. So in a subcritical state, when things are too inhibition dominant, the system's not responding at all. In a supercritical state, the whole system is sort of firing in lockstep. And so this is what you get when you're in sort of like epileptic regimes. So both are pathological states for brain function. But in a critical state, when that ratio is right at 1, we can introduce some information into the system. And as I intimated in my earlier example, that information will persist, and provably the persistence of that information is maximal when you're right at the critical point. So I'll go back to this branching ratio, this sigma statistic. Subsequently, I'll tell you how we calculate that from brain dynamics. But for now, just I wanted to indicate that this is one of the ways that we measure these emergent properties in the brain. So one of the first studies that we looked at was a developmental study in collaboration with Beatrice Luna at University of Pittsburgh. And Bea has been looking for years at developmental trajectories and shifts in EI balance. And we knew that if we were to look at some of these emergent properties, we could infer something about EI balance in an EEG sample they've collected from, this is a group of healthy children through adolescence into adulthood. These are just EEG recordings collected at rest. And we have eyes open and eyes closed data. And sure enough, we found that, especially in eyes closed case, you could detect a nice drop off in the EI ratio based on that we infer from the dynamics that we observe. And then also you can probably see here there's a shift towards lower EI balance when people open their eyes, and that's important. I'll get back to that in just a second. But we also see that as a result of this change in EI balance, we get an increase in some of these emergent properties that I talked about. So we're going to use an analysis called detrended fluctuation analysis to look at long-range temporal correlations in brain activity. And so what do I mean about that? So basically, this is trying to capture the idea that if you inject some information into the system, it's going to persist over time. And the way we back that out from EEG data is that we look at the long-range temporal correlations in the amplitude, in band-limited amplitude. So if we were to look at alpha waves, for example, in some cases, alpha waves have high amplitude, and other times they have low amplitude, and these things are correlated over time. And it's a much longer range than we're talking about with typical autocorrelation, which falls off as an exponential function. Long-range temporal correlations, the amplitude goes up and it stays up for tens of seconds, or it goes down and it stays down for tens of seconds. And we can infer, using this detrended fluctuation analysis, we can infer something about the relationship between the amount of samples I take into account and how much fluctuation there is in this amplitude profile over time. And in a strongly correlated system, the fluctuation in the amplitude goes up more rapidly with the size of the window that I analyze. And so in log scale, we plot out these functions of window size versus our fluctuation versus window size. And we can see that in the case of strong long-range temporal correlations, that slope is steeper. The exponent, or the slope is close to 1. And in fact, in simulated systems, you can show that long-range temporal correlations, when you have criticality, that value is 1. Indicating persistence of information over time. In a completely uncorrelated system, that slope takes on a value of 0.5. So in normal human brains, we expect there to be some correlation, but maybe not perfect criticality. And so usually the values are between 0.5 uncorrelated and the value of 1 at the critical point. So interestingly, this measure shows really nice retest reliability within participants, but also it has a strong genetic component. So in this one study, they showed, for example, that if you look at monozygotic twins, there's much stronger correlation than you have with dizygotic twins. And this is, again, using long-range temporal correlations in EEG data. Accompanying our earlier observation, that we found a decrease in EI balance, which is consistent with developmental literature on synaptic pruning in adolescents especially. We also find an increase in long-range temporal correlations in both the alpha and beta band. And you can see that it's pretty much a scalp-wide thing. So, we get these much stronger long-range correlations in wide frequency bands across neural development and brain maturation. We also see an increase in something called bistability. And so here the idea is we're not looking at necessarily, how does amplitude correlate over time, but we're just looking at the fact that in a critical system, you have a sort of metastability. So sometimes as I mentioned earlier, amplitude is quite high and it persists to be in a high state, and sometimes it's low. But it's not like you get everything in between. In fact, what you do get is a bimodal distribution. So you tend to get a lot of up states when the brain is showing very large amplitude alpha oscillations, and down states when it's showing low amplitude oscillations. And it seems to flip back and forth between these in a metastable way. And so you can say something about whether or not the brain is near a critical point by looking at how bimodal is that distribution? Is it a single unimodal distribution kind of smeared out, or do you get strong persistence in metastable upstate and downstates? And sure enough, we see that with development, we get an increase in bistability, indicating stronger bimodality in both, again, the alpha and beta band here. But it also depends on not just age, but also state factors. So in this case, we looked at eyes open versus eyes closed, and we're looking at the alpha band, and we saw very clear, very strong scalp-wide effects where when people open their eyes, long-range temporal correlations get weaker. And this is consistent with the idea that when you open your eyes, all of a sudden you have all this visual information coming into the brain, and you have to process those visual percepts. And in order to do so, and to stabilize the representations that are associated with that processing, you need more feed-forward and feedback inhibition. And that dynamic change in sort of EI balance that's associated with visual processing causes a global reduction in long-range temporal correlations, in this case, in the alpha band. Now, I mentioned that long-range temporal correlations merge at criticality. So when we have balanced excitation to inhibition, we should have strongest long-range temporal correlations, and then it should fall off in either direction, either because of too much excitation or too much inhibition. We should get a reduction in these long-range temporal correlations as measured by this detrended fluctuation analysis. And so then a prediction is that if we have people who are on this left side of the curve, so they're already sort of inhibition dominant, when they open their eyes, if there's more cortical inhibition, they should have a weakening of long-range temporal correlations. But on the other side, if there's somebody who as an individual has a more excitation dominant brain, when they open their eyes, that should shift them towards the critical point. And so they should actually have stronger long-range temporal correlations. And so this is the prediction. If your EI balance is above 1, your excitation dominant, then you open your eyes, your long-range temporal correlations should go up. And if they're below 1 and you open your eyes, then your long-range temporal correlation should go down. And sure enough, that's what we see across the age range. There's kind of an interesting effect here, which is if you squint, you can sort of see, but the relative difference between eyes open and eyes closed tends to be larger for adults than it is for children, suggesting that adults operate with a more kind of dynamical transition between eyes open and eyes closed, perhaps because when their brain settles towards the critical point, they have more sort of more sensitivity and susceptibility to state than children have. And that's a significant effect. So, okay, so now let's think about cognition. All right, so what does this have to do with cognition? So one of the properties of critical systems is about their susceptibility. And so one prediction is that critical systems are going to be, especially when you start to move into the supercritical regime, less sensitive to bottom-up information. So let's say you have a goal in mind, whether it be in a Stroop task or an anti-saccade task like this. In an anti-saccade task, you have some information that when you see a cue, you're supposed to saccade in the opposite direction. So, of course, this involves cognitive control, and you have to do a sort of top-down operation and bias yourself to do opposite the thing that is intuitive or habitual or natural, which is to look at the cue. And so the question is, do we tend to make correct anti-saccades when that is the rule at hand? And we can switch back and forth, so we can also look at task switching. So the prediction would be that if you have a more supercritical brain, you're less sensitive to the bottom-up information and therefore more able to do correct anti-saccades when that is the rule that you're holding in mind. And so the question is, do we see people who have more supercritical brains showing more correct anti-saccades? And sure enough, we find that if we look at that branching statistic that I talked about earlier, sigma, we find, especially in adults, the effect is less there in children, but especially in adults, that higher branching statistics indicating more cortical excitability and more in the direction of supercritical dynamics, we find more anti-saccade accuracy. Now, the interesting thing is that this measure was taken while people are at rest. So, so if we're looking at kind of resting EEG dynamics, we can predict something about how they're going to subsequently perform on the anti-saccade trial. We also use this FEI measure, which I've talked about a couple times. I haven't really gone into how that's calculated, but it is related to long-range temporal correlations. And again, we see that when people are more in the supercritical direction, when that FEI value is above 1, they tend to perform better at the anti-saccade task than those who are in the more subcritical direction. And I'm just showing a scalp topography here because we can do that with FEI, and we tend to see that sort of there's kind of a fronto rostrocaudal midline ensemble of electrodes that are sensitive to this contrast here. Okay, but criticality is not always going to make things better. So I mentioned that one of the key properties of a critical system is susceptibility. So, there's this classic notion in cognitive control research about the distinction between flexibility and stability, right? And so in a sort of simplified way, criticality is about promoting flexibility. And so if we have more critical brains, we should be, in some cases, worse at tasks that involve or require stable maintenance of rules to guide our behavior. And so we looked at this in the case of a memory-guided saccade task. And here in this task, you have a cue indicating where you're supposed to look, and then that cue goes away. And so there's a delay period where you're supposed to hold the rule in mind about what you're supposed to do. And then you get an arrow saying that you can act on that rule, and you're supposed to saccade to where you remember the thing to be. So we can look at accuracy, how close you were to the target. We can look at speed, how long it took you to make the saccade, things like that. And one prediction would be that if you have individuals who have more critical-like brains, closer to that critical point, because they're more susceptible, then small differences in trial-to-trial brain state are going to have a larger influence on how well they perform this task. So one of the predictions would be more critical-like brains should predict lower accuracy and more trial-to-trial variability. And that's exactly what we see. So if we look especially in the beta band, a frequency which has captured a lot of people's interest with respect to cognitive control processes, people who have stronger long-range temporal correlations at rest, more critical-like brains, especially adults, tend to show more error. They deviate more from the target on the memory-guided saccades. We also see more error variability, so more trial-to-trial variability in how sort of consistently they perform this task. And so again, if you have stronger long-range temporal correlations at rest, you have a more critical-like brain at rest, then your performance varies more from trial to trial when you're doing the task. And also we see this in terms of reaction time. So again, here we see not just that people are performing worse, but also they're slower, especially in adults. If you have stronger long-range temporal correlations, you respond slower. And there's more trial-to-trial variability in how accurate you are. And notably, of course, this is beta band. These are kind of frontal electrodes that seem to be involved in these processes, all sort of pointing to or implicating top-down control and trial-to-trial variability and top-down control on performance of a task. Okay, so now let's get to my original sort of inspiration in this field, and that is thinking about cognitive effort. So, this is a topic which has just been really fascinating to me for a long time. Why is it that thinking about problems feels like work? And I think there's a lot of great theories out there, and some of them are sort of related, some of them are quite distinct. But at the end of the day, what I'd like to know is, how can we measure the subjective phenomenology in terms of brain dynamics, but also what does the brain care about? Why, if we can do such amazing things, when we can sit and focus and we can plan for the future and we can make careful decisions, why is our brain treating that act as such an aversive thing? It almost doesn't make sense. And so there must be something really important that happens when we engage in difficult problems that the brain has, through evolution perhaps, learned to treat as especially costly. And so when we get to this moment of thinking, it becomes like a cost-benefit decision. We decide, is it worth it for me to stay engaged or not? But also, there's really big individual differences. So some people, and this is controlling for their ability to do a task, some people are just much more willing to exert cognitive effort than others. And what's that about? And then interestingly, why is it that in some circumstances, like multitasking, for example, we feel that staying focused is so much more aversive than it might otherwise be? Now, this last point has been related to, I'm sure many of you know, this kind of prominent idea about cognitive effort, that the reason that we treat thinking as costly is because it incurs opportunity costs. So this is what got me thinking about criticality. If it is true that the brain cares about opportunity costs, then what it must make reference to is the brain's ability to adapt to new opportunities, right? Specifically, if we're engaged deeply in a task and we're therefore less able to switch over to new tasks, then opportunity cost should be higher. And we should experience that loss or that incursion of opportunity cost as costly. So as I talked about earlier, one of the key properties of a critical system is its susceptibility, its capacity to respond to new information. So the intuition here was that critical brains should not be experiencing opportunity cost. But as soon as you deviate from that critical point, all of a sudden you've lost susceptibility, you've lost capacity to rapidly transition into other states. And therefore, you should have higher opportunity cost. So my basic hypothesis here was that deviation from criticality is what the brain treats as costly. Interestingly, there's some nice evidence showing that the brain deviates from criticality systematically as you're doing harder and harder things. So Omid Kardan had this great paper from 2019 showing that when people do a visual working memory task, there's a monotonic deviation from criticality. This is actually a measure of long-range temporal correlations across the scalp. And they get progressively weaker as you do tasks with higher and higher working memory load. And then a decade earlier, so these ideas, there's some really interesting work from fMRI from 2009, quite a while back now, showing that when people are engaged in a demanding task, so you get typical task positive activation networks like frontal parietal networks and dorsal attention networks, and then you get deactivation in regions like default mode network like regions. But interestingly, with it, you get a suppression again of long-range temporal correlations that after you stop doing the task, take a long time to recover. So in this study, they found that it took on the order of, after a two-back, almost 10 minutes for the brain to get back to a baseline state of long-range temporal correlations. So the tasks were suppressed as a function of load, and there's a really slow recovery process. So these studies got me really interested, well, maybe what the brain cares about is this dynamical process of deviation from criticality and slow recovery and the loss of the desirable computational properties that come with that. So to ask this question, one of the things that we did is to use a paradigm that I've used for a decade now, and that's the cognitive effort discounting task. So in this task, we have people do increasingly difficult levels of the in-back task and then make choices. Do you want to do a harder task for more money or an easier task for less money? And we look at where people make trade-offs. And so if they're, let's say, indifferent between the $4 for the two-back and $1.79 for the one-back, then we can infer that it cost that person subjectively about $2.21 to do the two-back versus the one-back. So we can look at the subjective value of this offer of $4 for the two-back, and we expect that as that load level increases to the 3, the 4, and the 5-back, and so forth, that the subjective value of that offer should go down because the task is more and more costly. And sure enough, we've seen this, hundreds of times now. People show these nice monotonic discounting functions. They really dislike doing high levels of the in-back task. But importantly, there's big individual differences here. So we have some people who they discount very little. So they're basically willing, they're game for any level of the task. And then we have people like this who, as soon as you get to the 2 and the 3-back, they're done. They give up a lot of money to avoid doing those harder levels of the task. And so one interesting question is, what's the difference between these? And one prediction is that this person, while they're doing the task, is able to keep their brain closer to that critical point than this person, who, when they're doing the very same task and the very same demands, controlling for their performance levels, their brain seems to deviate more from that critical point. And so that was one of the hypotheses that I had. And so here we're going to be thinking about the critical branching process I talked about earlier, and we're going to take it quite literally. So this is, of course, an artificial network of neurons, but we do see neuronal avalanches in the brain. And so some of the seminal work on this was done, again, almost 20 years ago in these in vitro slice preparations, where they had a slice of cortical tissue and they had a microelectrode array. And they found that spontaneously there would be a burst of activity and it would be clustered together in time. So a neuron would fire and then another one would fire, or one neuron would fire and then 3 neurons would fire. And in this seminal work, where they first sort of defined these branching statistics, they did a simple thing where they said, well, when you have a cluster of activity together, let's take the number of neurons active in the second time step versus the number of neurons in the first time step, and that ratio is our branching statistic. So larger branching statistics imply avalanches that grow faster, and if on average that a value is higher, that implies a cortical system which has greater excitability. And in these early studies, they did nice things where they played around with drugs that would block GABA or glutamate, and as they expected, they would get sort of increases and decreases in the branching statistic, respectively. Now, I hinted at earlier the fact that there's this really cool property of a critical system. An emergent property is power law distributed avalanche sizes. So what this means is that you get a lot of very small avalanches where only 1 or 2 neurons fire, but you get a non-zero. It falls off with a power law slope of -1.5. There's really cool theoretical work that shows this, and it's been shown time and time again in real tissues. That this distribution falls off with a slope of -1.5, which means that you have a non-zero probability of larger and larger and larger avalanches. If you had an infinitely large slice of tissue and an infinite number of electrodes, in principle, you could get avalanches that propagate to infinity. And so what's, you can sort of intuit why this is really important for long-range correlations, right? That if you inject a little bit of information, the probability that that would spread across the entire sample of tissue, is non-zero, and that's really important for information processing. So I just wanted to show this because you can do this in the same preparation, where if you include more and more electrodes here, you get that cutoff point just keeps going farther and farther out. So it's not a deep property of the tissue so much as it is just a practical experimental boundary. So how can we do this in EEG data? Well, we don't have discrete neurons that are firing, but because of this property that avalanches can propagate to infinity, just the size of the tissue that you have, you can also get very large coordinated firing of activity that will result in large amplitude deviations in the local field potential. And so large amplitude deviations indicate a lot of local neuronal synchrony, the kind of thing that happens in the context of an avalanche. And we can do this thing where we just simply threshold our raw EEG trace, and we say anything above or below that threshold, we'll call that an event. And we'll ask how these events are clustered together in time, just like you would if you were looking at individual neurons. And fascinatingly, the exact same statistical properties govern what you can record, in this case in MEG data, as what you can record at individual neurons. And it's the same slope because it literally is the same line just extended on into the tail there. Okay, so let's talk about event rate dynamics. What do we see? So if we're doing the in-back task, we can look at when these events occur and with what intensity. And so this is a plot of events over time, and I'm showing you this during the in-back task. So 0 indicates when the stimulus starts, which happens right now, and then you'll see this big drop in event production, and then a slow recovery of event rates. So we have increasing synchrony during this maintenance period. And that synchrony happens especially in these kind of lateral electrodes above the ear here. And then the stimulus comes on and we have a drop again. And so what does this look like over time? With respect to the time of the stimulus onset, we can compute our branching statistic. And we find a nice canonical shape, which actually happens in a lot of tasks, where during the maintenance period, you have kind of supercritical branching, and then the stimulus comes on and you have a jump in the supercritical direction, indicating a lot of cortical synchrony. You might have heard that in classic animal studies, they've shown a reduction in brain variability when presented with a new stimulus. That's exactly what we're seeing here. So there's this phasic reduction in variability and phasic increase in synchrony in the supercritical direction, followed by a dip in the subcritical direction and a slow recovery. But what you notice, of course, is that there's really a lot of deviation away from this theoretically important value of 1, this branching statistic we should get when people's brains are at criticality, right? There's a lot of stuff going on dynamically within a trial to push it away from that point. So we have supercritical regimes and subcritical regimes at different time points. This dynamic does appear to depend on load. So in the in-back task, we have targets and regular trials. And you have to squint here, I admit, but you see a little bit more of a jump in the target case, and then a steeper dip and a slower recovery. Well, maybe that's just noise. But if we look at a switch task, we see it much more clearly. So here and I think the reason has to do with the fact that the in-back task is a pretty complicated cognitive task involving a lot of different operations. So we can talk about that. But in this switch task, all we have to do is we either stick with our response or we switch to a new response on every trial. And so in the switch task, we see a very clear separation here. On the demanding switch trials, there's a bigger jump in synchrony right after the stimulus onset and a bigger dip and a much slower process of recovery in the branching statistic. Okay, does this have anything to do with effort? Well, my hypothesis was that if you deviate more from this critical point when you're performing the in-back task, you're going to find the task to be more costly. So I looked at deviation from this value of 1 and the absolute value of that deviation. And I looked at that across as a function of in-back levels. And I also looked as a function of willingness to work. So low willingness to work are those people with a low AUC, so they discount a lot, and high willingness to work are those people who are sort of game for anything. And sure enough, I found a kind of monotonic relationship here that seemed to interact with willingness to work. So people who deviate more in the sub or supercritical direction find the task to be more costly than those who stay closer to criticality. And we also see this in incorrect trials, but there's a kind of flip in terms of load effects. So I'm going to stop here because I know I've talked through a lot of ideas, but of course I need to I couldn't have done this work without incredible collaborators over the years. I've been very grateful to have, and also to the National Institute of Mental Health for supporting this work, and be happy to stop here and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this very interesting talk. We have a couple of minutes for questions. So please raise your hand, or you can also use the Q&A feature on Zoom. Alexandra?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sure you said this and I missed it. Could you define effort in your framework for me again? Sorry if I'm sure you said it, but I missed it. Sorry about this.
Not at all. Yeah. Thank you. So my idea is basically that effort is okay, so I'm interested in the subjective phenomenology, the experience that we have of costliness when people are doing tasks. And I am proposing that subjective experience is the phenomenological readout of the brain's detecting deviance or deviation from criticality. So now I don't know what that mechanism is, but however the brain detects that it has deviated from criticality, it uses that information to say, hey, this is a costly state, and signals it with phenomenological aversion so that you stop engaging with the task and you allow your brain to relax back to a critical state.
So in your view, it doesn't matter how high any objective, whatever that means, costs of any process are. You're interested in basically the opportunity cost. Is this correct? So there is some kind of computation of what else I could do with whatever the resources are that I'm spending on a given process.
That's an excellent question. I would love to hear your thoughts about it. My guess is that when we talk about opportunity costs, we can't do the full menu. We can't compute all the opportunities in our environment and keep a track of those. That seems implausible to me. So instead, what we might do is pay attention to something about the sort of dissipation of our capacities, and that's basically what I'm aiming at, is that the loss of criticality is an indication of the loss of capacities. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what other people have to think about that.
Thank you.
Further questions? Yeah, Kimberly and Kendra.
Kendra had her hand up first. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'm curious, just listening to this. I've been trying to think about how to frame this question. But I'm wondering how you think this connects or is related to some of the research on variability in the brain, and the work of like Matt Garrett and Jimenez Larkin and that whole group. I know they focused on aging, but I think there is an intersection here. I just haven't quite figured out what it is yet.
Yeah, totally. I think there is. It's one we're going to pursue. We're starting to pursue rather. If you think about the sort of example I showed with the Ising model, I mean, one of the things you very clearly see there is a lot of variability, and this is, you need variability to get long-range temporal correlations in the first place. There's variability in both spatial and temporal domains. There's some nice work showing that critical systems are associated with higher entropy, and that's another measure of variability. And that moreover, both of these measures, both measures of criticality and measures of entropy, are associated with higher fluid intelligence, for example. And so there's 2 studies I can think of. It's a small number, so this is like a domain which really deserves more attention. But 2 fMRI studies now that I can think of have shown this result of higher fluid intelligence associated with greater criticality. And if you took the standard deviation as your measure, I'm almost certain they would correlate.
Can I add a follow-up question really quick, Kim? I know that there's also been some study of variability in behavior, like a lot more literature actually on that than on fMRI, and I'm wondering how that maps on. Like, I think about particularly in aging, the studies, there's more variability in behavior, but maybe less variability in the brain. And so I'm just curious if you think that what you're observing here would map onto behavior in any way.
Yeah, really great question. There's a fantastic study by Matthias Palva and lab that has from I think 2013 PNAS showing that there's a correspondence between the power law scaling of brain dynamics that I talked about and the power law scaling of behavior. This was done in humans, but basically they fit power laws to avalanche properties, and they also fit power laws to, say, reaction times. So, there's this well-known effect where sometimes people go through these periods of kind of slow reaction times and then fast reaction times. And so reaction times also show long-range temporal correlations. And what they showed is that, people who have kind of stronger long-range temporal correlations in, say, reaction times or error rates also have stronger long-range temporal correlations in brain activity. And then I would also point out there's a really excellent study by Woodrow Hsu. This is using kind of some of this, multiplanar calcium imaging of a rodent brain, where you can get, tens of thousands of neurons or whatever the number. And you get really rich spatial temporal dynamics there. And they had a head fixed preparation where you could look at, I'm sorry, they were fixed in a chamber. So you could look at head turning and whisking and pupil dilation and any measure they looked at. So this is not overt responding to a task. This is just like subtle random fluctuations in pupil dilation were strongly correlated with the neuronal avalanches they observed in the brain tissue. So a lot at a very fundamental level of behavior is dictated by the variability that arises, the emergent variability that arises at criticality.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Kim.
Thanks. Great talk, Andrew. I feel like I have so many questions about like thinking about these findings relative to past work on the subjective experience of effort, right? Because I think you have this data that shows that it's scaling with, you know, sort of objective metrics of cognitive effort, like the end-back load, right? But also this, like these differences in people's willingness to expend, and I think it's the subjective experience that you're trying to get at here. Does that seem accurate?
Yes.
So yeah, I'm sort of, when I'm thinking about this, especially in the context of the developmental data, it seems to me that you can think about people as different brains as potentially at a different criticality point, and then different levels of criticality, and then with the expenditure of effort, there's this deviation from that criticality point that's being detected as the experience of effort. I'm trying to wrap my head around how you reconcile this with, you know, you have it with variability in sort of need for cognition or willingness to work, but you could also imagine as people's brains are at a different point, you know, related to not trait factors, but things like age or something, as well as state. Are you thinking that sort of the amount of deviation from criticality is I want to say like it's experienced subjectively, and that subjective experience can vary, but can the amount of deviation itself be sort of like a standing quantitative measure? I don't think I'm explaining my question very well, but hopefully that makes sense. Is this like sort of like is there an aspect of universality here that can get around like certain levels of variation in like where people's brains are as a starting point, as well as the extent to which the subjective experience might vary with matched levels of objective effort?
Yeah. There are a lot of aspects to that. I think that so clearly there, you know, in the scatter plots that I showed, for example, just as an empirical observation, there's a lot of other stuff going on, you know, so it's not like these data lie on a single straight line, but criticality is contributing to the milieu of factors that you know reflect efficient neural efficiency in processing, that are sensitive to neuromodulatory states, to neural development, to cognitive aging that was mentioned earlier, you know, so there's a lot of other factors that are at play here. I think our goal experimentally is to show that criticality contributes to that subjective experience, you know, once you take all these other factors into account. One of the things that we're doing now, I didn't talk about, is we're using TMS to modulate cortical excitability. And so you may know there are these protocols that you can use TMS to, you know, over an hour, let's say, kind of up or down regulate cortical excitability. And what we hope to be able to show is that we can influence subjective effort, you know, by indirectly sort of manipulating brain criticality in a way that I'm saying is independent of cognitive demands or even cognitive capacities. And so I think that kind of causal experiment has not been done, but is one of the tacks that we're taking to show how much it contributes. I don't know, did that answer the question?
I think it helped. I think this is a really interesting principle for sort of you know, integrating some of these things that are occurring at the individual level as well as the state level. And
Yeah.
I think I'm just trying to almost like wrap my head around the concept, the metric as a concept, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, I think I'm sure there's subjectivity with respect to how people process brain criticality as well, right? So if you're somebody who, I mean, just to let's see if this is going to take me a second to go back here, but what I wanted to just go back to was at the beginning showing these kind of individual differences in, yeah, here we go. So long-range temporal correlations with development, right? So, so there's a couple of interesting things here which I didn't highlight. So one of them, so there's this increase in long-range temporal correlations in alpha and beta for across the age range, but there's also a kind of heteroscedasticity. So there's more individual difference variance in adults than there is in children. I mean, you can see it pretty clearly here in this kind of beta band that children are they're sort of starting in a similar spot here. But then when you get into adulthood, you have some adults which look, they're basically where the mean was for children. And then you have some adults who are showing, much more robust long-range temporal correlations. And so I think that, there's going to be a lot of factors that influence neural development, of course, early life stress, all kinds of learning experiences, environmental pollutants, so forth. So there'll be a lot of individual differences in how people experience criticality throughout their life, and their experience of engaging with tasks in the face of the loss of criticality when they're doing those demanding tasks. So I feel like there's got to be a lot of subjectivity that arises through that learning process as well. So some people are going to experience the same levels of subcriticality as more costly than other people is what I'm trying to say, basically.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions?
There's one in the chat.
Oh yeah, I just noticed them. So there's a question by Dana Arnold, who asked, when you say adults, how old were the populations that you studied?
This is it. Yeah, so this is our cutoff. So we stopped with 30-year-olds. We are starting to do some work looking at older adults because of, again, really nice work showing differences in neural variability with aging, but also I talked about power law slopes. So one famous power law that anybody who does EG knows is the 1/f law. That's another power law indicative of that could be related in interesting ways to criticality, let's say, but that also shifts in older adults, and some people have inferred that implies progressive increases in cortical excitability with aging. So that I think is something we're very keen to understand better. Thank you.
There's another question by Sebastian Horn.
Thanks also from my side. I have a question that goes a little bit into the direction of Kim's question also, but I wondered, I mean, I guess one way you could view cognitive effort, it's a latent construct that can be measured with all kinds of variables, right? Different indicators. And the way I understood it is that your criticality measure or deviation from criticality would be one such indicator. So I just wondered, have you also looked more closer? Are there other papers like more comprehensively into different measures like subjective ratings and maybe other physiological measures? So one that I know is frequently discussed in the motivation literature is measures of heart rate, where, for example, Dollar has done a lot of work in this direction. They argue this is the measure to go. So I wonder, can you say something how highly these measures are correlated? And would you say this speaks to, that indeed there is a construct of cognitive effort that can be captured with all of these? Or do you think it's more complicated at the moment? It's not so clear whether you can say really there is this construct that is really valid.
I love that question. I mean, I think we're at such a stage of methodological development in this field. And I should say that, so there's this kind of literature on brain criticality, and there's people who have from a theoretical perspective and an empirical perspective, ask the question, well, is the brain really a critical system or not? Or is it sort of pseudo-critical? And, you know, how would it give these emergent properties if it weren't a critical system? And so that's an interesting world, but, you know, that world has been completely almost not conversed at all with the world about sort of cognitive neuroscience. And so understanding what are the implications for cognitive function is really important. And in this world of cognitive neuroscience, of course, there have been all these great measures that you talk about, like heart rate variability, for example. I'm glad you brought that up. That's, you know, when I was looking at long-range temporal correlations, we did a study looking at effort discounting and long-range temporal correlations in heart variability. And we found that, you know, as you get sort of, now, to be clear, the heart does not show critical dynamics. However, it does have long-range temporal correlations. And based on some of what I was saying earlier about the multi-slice calcium imaging work, you know, the power law, slopes and the long-range temporal correlations in lots of physiological measures should correlate with what's going on in the brain. So that's the grounding. What we found was that stronger long-range temporal correlations in heart dynamics, sort of exceeding that nice value of 1, happen when you do harder and harder tasks. So you get sort of farther and farther away from that theoretical value of 1. Interestingly, this was done in healthy adults and people with depression, and we found that people with current depression, they didn't deviate as much. So it's almost like you could use this scaling of heart rate long-range temporal correlations as an indicator of how much people were invested in the task, and that seemed to be diminished in people with depression. So that's a teaser, but I think there's a whole world of these measures that you talk about that need to be applied, and we need to understand how they relate. Pupil dilation would be another one. I think it's a really good target for this kind of work.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
And there's another question in the chat by Noah Richard, who asked, to your knowledge, have there been any efforts at turning criticality into formalized models, perhaps including parameters to account for inter-individual differences, so as to include or combine criticality with existing cognitive models?
That's a great question. Well, I guess one question I have is about, you know, the level of the model. So there's definitely been a lot of models that have tried to formalize brain dynamics. And there's a lot of different types of brain dynamics that one could relate to criticality. So yeah, formal models that have related in terms of like, you know, well, like the Ising-like models, or, you know, like the Kuramoto oscillator models, you know, they also show these critical phase transitions between ordered and or synchronous and asynchronous states. And so these kind of formal models of brain dynamics, there have been these kind of formal models of simulated systems which actually recreate what happened in terms of complex brain dynamics. And so there's one really nice one that has been applied using kind of Wilson-Cowan excitatory inhibitory pools of neurons to predict what happens in terms of like whole brain measures of functional connectivity. And so that paper, which is on bioRxiv now, is a shining example of this. In terms of formal models of behavior, I don't know of anything. I can't think of anything right off. I think that yeah, it's terra incognita. So let's do it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andrew. I think
Thank you.
we're just in time. Thank you very much for presenting your research. Thank you everybody for attending and kicking off this year's talk series. We will be announcing future talks soon, and we will also make available the recording of today's session on our website. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
And for discussing.
Thanks for the opportunity.